different. It could get a little bit combative, as you can probably imagine, because I came in, yes, from Georgia, family values and a strong sense of, spiritual growth, always wanted to be the best I can. And he came with his positive ability to see the world, make money, get out there. And so I think you always hope in a marriage that you can bring out the best in each other. But after many years,
John Miller had always been a man of routine. Each morning, the alarm rang precisely at 6:30 a.m., and the first thing he did was reach for the newspaper, his fingers grazing the smooth surface of the black and white print. The quiet serenity of his morning routine was a foundation on which he had built the structure of his life, steady, predictable, and safe. He was the senior associate at a law firm in the small yet affluent suburban city of Ashford. To the world outside, he was simply another man in a suit, an invisible cog in a massive machine. His colleagues respected him for his diligence and professionalism, and John was content with that. The office, after all, was a place of order and reliability, a place where no one asked too many questions. It was a rainy Tuesday when things began to change. The air had that heavy electric charge to it, as if something significant was about to happen, though John could not put his finger on it. The morning started like any other. He arrived at the office promptly at 8 a.m., greeted by the usual nods and murmurs of colleagues filing into their cubicles. He slid into his desk, the hum of the fluorescent lights above cutting through the silence as he organized his notes for the upcoming merger meeting. The firm's work was meticulous, structured, and typically not the kind that invited attention. Clients were kept at arm's length, and confidentialities were guarded with ironclad secrecy. John was good at his job. He understood the intricacies of legal language and the art of negotiation. His days were consumed with reading documents, preparing drafts, and offering legal counsel. Everything seemed simple enough, and that was how he liked it. He was content in his routine, in his predictable life. But that Tuesday, there was a shift in the atmosphere, subtle, imperceptible to most, but undeniable to John. As he sat reviewing a contract for one of their business clients, his attention drifted toward the office door. There was a strange sense of unease in the air, a tension that seemed to cling to the walls. It wasn't the usual hustle of the office, the casual chatter, the clinking of keyboards, the hum of the copier machine. No, today felt different. And then he saw Robert Harris walk by. Robert, a junior partner at the firm, was not someone who drew attention. He was quiet, reserved, and generally kept to himself. Most people didn't know much about him beyond the basics. His work ethic was impeccable, and his results were undeniable. He had joined the firm several years ago, fresh out of law school, and had quickly risen through the ranks due to his sharp mind and meticulous nature. But to John, Robert had always been something of an enigma. He never made small talk. Never participated in office gossip and rarely attended after-hours gatherings. He was a man of few words, and for the most part, that made John feel comfortable. People like Robert rarely caused trouble, and that made them safe. But on this particular day, Robert wasn't acting like himself. John noticed the quick pace with which he moved through the office. Normally, Robert's gait was slow and deliberate, but today, he practically darted down the hallway. His face, usually impassive, was drawn tight with concentration. John furrowed his brow as he watched him disappear around the corner, heading toward the conference room. Something about the way Robert carried himself seemed off, urgent, almost as if he were on the cusp of something momentous. It wasn't like John to pry into other people's affairs, but his curiosity was piqued. He had worked alongside Robert for years, but in all that time, he had never seen him act this way. He tried to focus on his work, but the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach refused to fade. What could Robert be up to? Why was he so eager to get into the conference room? And who was he meeting with? John's mind raced as he tried to ignore the gnawing suspicion building inside him. He had too much work to do, too many cases to manage, and there was no room in his day for distractions. But the feeling lingered, gnawing at him like a quiet whisper that wouldn't go away. He glanced at the clock, 10:30 a.m. He was due in a meeting in half an hour, but he couldn't shake the sense that something was unfolding just beyond his reach. Unable to quell his growing sense of unease, John decided to take a quick walk. He would stretch his legs, clear his mind, and push the thoughts of Robert and whatever he was up to out of his head. He stood up from his desk, adjusting his tie as he exited the office, heading toward the break room. The hallways were quiet, the low buzz of conversation just out of earshot. As he passed the conference room, he slowed his pace. The door was slightly ajar, and through the narrow gap, he could see Robert talking to a man he didn't recognize. John stopped dead in his tracks. The man was older, with salt and pepper hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. His suit was perfectly tailored, the dark fabric cutting a stark contrast against the soft cream of the conference room's walls. The stranger was leaning over the table, his hand resting on a large stack of papers in front of him. He spoke in low, measured tones, his voice cutting through the quiet air like a knife. Robert, for his part, appeared to be listening intently, nodding occasionally in agreement. There was something about the exchange that struck John as odd, as though they were discussing something far more important than mere legal matters. The conversation was too muffled for John to hear clearly, but he caught enough to realize that whatever was being discussed wasn't routine. They were talking about political favors, lobbying, behind-the-scenes deals, and influence that stretched far beyond the boundaries of their firm. John's heart skipped a beat. Was he hearing this right? Political favors? That didn't belong in a law firm. The man's name, John didn't catch it entirely, but he heard something about the senator's campaign, and it was enough to send a cold shiver down his spine. What did the senator have to do with their firm? Why was Robert involved in this? Was he acting as a conduit between the firm and these political figures? John stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. His mind raced as he processed what he had just overheard. He knew that whatever Robert and the stranger were discussing had be important, perhaps even dangerous. The implications were too far-reaching for him to ignore, but at the same time, John was torn. He had worked hard to get to where he was. His career, his reputation, everything was tied to this job. But if this was what it seemed to be, if Robert was involved in something more sinister, then John was already in the middle of it, whether he liked it or not. With his heart still pounding in his chest, John walked back to his desk, trying to maintain his composure. He sank into his chair, but his hands were clammy as he tried to focus on his work. It was no use. The images from the conference room, the shadowy figures, the low murmurs, kept replaying in his mind. His thoughts swirled in a vortex of confusion and suspicion. Robert had always seemed so controlled, so calm, but now John was seeing a side of him that he had never imagined. This was no longer just a simple day at the office. It was the beginning of something far more complicated and dangerous. John tried to push the thoughts aside, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled upon something that would change everything. The question now was what he was going to do about it. Would he ignore it, pretend it never happened? Or would he dig deeper, risking his career, and perhaps even his safety, to uncover the truth behind Robert's secret dealings? There was no turning back now. The days following the incident felt like a blur to John. The office remained its usual hum of activity, the rhythm of the workday continuing as if nothing had changed. Yet, every time John sat at his desk, reviewing case files or drafting legal documents, his mind kept wandering back to that moment in the conference room, the conversation he had overheard, the stranger, the mention of political influence, and Robert's unnerving involvement. The mundane tasks he once completed with ease now felt like they were happening in another world, a world that no longer seemed so clear and uncomplicated. The normalcy of his life had been shattered in one brief, yet impactful moment. John couldn't focus. Every flicker of movement in the office made him tense. Every shadow cast in the corner of his eye made him jump. His once solid routine began to feel like an illusion, as if he were slowly losing control. He kept asking himself the same questions. What was going on behind the scenes? What had Robert really been talking about? Why hadn't he come forward to explain himself? But most of all, John couldn't shake the question that kept gnawing at him. What did all of this mean for him? The uncertainty grew worse with each passing day. Robert seemed as calm and controlled as ever. He still kept to his usual patterns, arriving early, leaving late, sitting quietly at his desk for hours, his eyes always focused on his work. Yet, John couldn't help but notice the subtle differences in his behavior. Robert seemed more distant, more closed off. His interactions with the other partners were curt, his conversations with the staff sparse. He had become a man whose every action seemed measured, deliberate. It was as if Robert had shifted into a different gear, one that John couldn't access or understand. It was during one of these routine days, when John's mind was particularly tangled in the confusion of what he had overheard, that he found himself once again standing by Robert's desk. It was late in the afternoon, and the office was beginning to empty out. The low hum of conversation had died down, and the clink of keyboards was the only sound left in the building. John had been meaning to speak with Robert for some time, to confront him about what he had witnessed in that conference room. But every time he thought about it, something held him back. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the sense that confronting Robert would lead him into a world he couldn't escape from. But today, John couldn't stop himself. He had to know more. Robert was sitting at his desk, his focus so intense that he didn't notice John approaching. He was absorbed in a set of documents, his eyes scanning each page with the kind of concentration that only someone truly invested in their work could maintain. For a moment, John hesitated. He had no clear reason to engage with Robert. He wasn't even sure what he wanted from the conversation. But he knew that the questions that plagued his mind could not remain unanswered forever. Taking a deep breath, John walked up to Robert's desk. The sound of his shoes on the carpet echoed through the empty office, breaking the silence. Robert didn't look up immediately, but John could see the subtle shift in his posture, the tightening of his shoulders, the slight narrowing of his eyes. Robert knew someone was there, and the fact that he didn't look up made John feel even more certain that Robert was aware of the tension hanging in the air. "Robert," John said, trying to keep his voice casual, as though this was a normal conversation. "How's everything going?" Robert glanced up, his face remaining neutral. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable, but it was gone before John could decipher it. He nodded slowly, as though acknowledging John's presence without truly engaging. "Everything's fine, John, just busy, you know how it is." He returned his attention to the papers in front of him, his fingers moving with precision as he turned a page. John stood there for a moment, unsure of how to proceed. His words felt heavy, like an invisible weight pressing down on him. The tension between them was palpable, thickening the air with every passing second. Robert was clearly avoiding eye contact, clearly doing everything he could to maintain control of the situation. But John knew that the time had come. He had to ask. "You've been acting differently lately," John began, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. "I've noticed you've been a little off." There was a brief pause before Robert finally looked up, his gaze sharpening, his lips pressed together in a thin line, his jaw tightening. "What do you mean by that?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that John hadn't heard before. John hesitated, but he had come too far to turn back now. "I don't know. It's just, you've been quieter than usual, and there's something about the way you've been acting, almost like you're, I don't know, hiding something." Robert's eyes darkened, but he didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The silence between them felt suffocating, as if it were wrapping around John, pushing in from all sides. Finally, Robert let out a slow, measured breath. "John, sometimes it's better not to know too much." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a finality in it that sent a chill down John's spine. "Trust me, it's better for you." John felt his pulse quicken. He had known this moment was coming. He had known that Robert wasn't going to open up easily. But hearing Robert's response made the knot in his stomach tighten. It was a warning, a clear signal that John had already ventured too far down a road he wasn't supposed to walk. And yet, despite the warning, John couldn't pull away. He had to know more. "What's going on, Robert?" John pressed, his voice thick with both concern and frustration. "I'm not asking for anything crazy. I just want to understand. What's happening?" Robert didn't answer immediately. He seemed to weigh John's words carefully, his gaze shifting from John's eyes to the desk before him. There was a brief flicker of something behind his expression, something fleeting, something vulnerable, but it was gone almost instantly. Robert straightened in his chair, his posture hardening. "This isn't your business, John. Don't make it yours." John's heart skipped a beat. The finality in Robert's voice left no room for negotiation. This was not a conversation about legal matters or case files. It was something far deeper, something far more dangerous. John could feel the weight of Robert's words settling over him like a suffocating blanket. He was being warned, but the curiosity, the need to know, gnawed at him relentlessly. What was Robert involved in? Who were the people he was dealing with? "Robert, I don't want to be in the dark about this. I'm not some pawn," John said, his voice rising slightly. He wasn't sure why he was pushing so hard, why the need for answers was so consuming. But the uncertainty was eating him alive, and he had no idea how to make it stop. For a brief moment, Robert's eyes softened. There was a hint of something. Guilt, perhaps, or hesitation. But it quickly disappeared. He stood up, pushing his chair back with a faint scrape of wood against the floor. The movement was deliberate, controlled. "I don't want to hear any more of this, John. Just let it go." With that, Robert turned and walked away, leaving John standing there alone in the quiet office. The tension still hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. John's hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. He had been dismissed, but he didn't know how to let this go. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it had already taken root deep within him. Robert's cryptic words, his warnings, his cold demeanor, they all pointed to something far darker, far more dangerous than John had ever imagined. And now, there was no turning back. The days stretched on, each one dragging behind the next, as John found himself falling deeper into a web of suspicion and confusion. His once simple existence, his predictable job, his quiet life in Ashford, had been turned upside down. The more he tried to focus on his work, the more the questions surrounding Robert's behavior, the political whispers, and the strange meetings plagued his mind. It was as if the world he had once thought he understood had become a dark, twisted labyrinth, and no matter which direction he turned, he couldn't escape. The tension was relentless, gnawing at him like a constant ache he couldn't soothe. John's routine had changed since that conversation with Robert. He found himself leaving work later, lingering in the office long after everyone else had gone home. He had tried to push the thoughts of Robert's cryptic warning aside, to convince himself that he was overreacting. But every day, it became harder to ignore the pull of curiosity, the need to understand what was happening beneath the surface. The firm, the people he worked with, the life he had built. It all felt like an illusion, one that was beginning to crack and crumble before his eyes. One particular Thursday, after a long day of reviewing documents, John found himself standing in front of the elevator, his thoughts consumed by the strange turn his life had taken. He had just finished another round of paperwork for an upcoming case, but the files that lay on his desk seemed insignificant compared to the chaos brewing in his mind. Robert's words, "Trust me, it's better for you. Don't make it yours," echoed in his head, a warning he couldn't ignore. As he stepped into the elevator, John felt the weight of the decision ahead of him. He could turn a blind eye, pretend nothing had changed, and leave everything as it was. But he knew deep down that there was no going back. The seed of doubt had taken root, and it had grown into something far more insistent, far more dangerous. He had to know the truth. The doors of the elevator closed with a soft ding, and as it descended, John felt his pulse quicken. The ground floor arrived too soon, and with a quiet breath, he stepped out into the lobby. He was about to leave for the day, but his mind was already elsewhere. He couldn't let this go. He had to confront Robert again. This time he needed answers. It wasn't that John was particularly brave. In fact, he had always been the cautious type, the kind of man who preferred to keep his head down and stay out of trouble. But something had shifted. The subtle manipulation he had witnessed in Robert's behavior, the power dynamics he had glimpsed behind the office doors. It all felt too big to ignore. What had started as a whisper in the shadows had now grown into a full-blown storm. And John was standing right in the center of it. When John returned to the office the following Monday, everything seemed normal. The firm's usual hum of activity was in full swing, the employees working diligently at their desks, the quiet, murmurs of conversation filling the air. But John couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from ordinary. He moved through the office like a ghost, his thoughts still consumed by the nagging questions he couldn't answer. Robert was nowhere to be found, and for the first time in weeks, John felt an odd sense of relief. But that relief was short-lived. Around midday, just as John was reviewing another batch of case files, he saw Robert walk into the office. His expression was unreadable, his gait steady, as he made his way to his desk. John observed him from across the room, noting the familiar, calculated movements, Robert's ability to slip seamlessly into the fabric of the office, to blend in and avoid attracting attention. But there was something different in his eyes, something cold, something distant that made John feel like a stranger in the room. As the day dragged on, John found it impossible to concentrate. His thoughts kept wandering back to that moment, the moment he had overheard Robert's conversation in the conference room. He kept replaying it in his mind, dissecting every word, every glance. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about Robert, how little he knew about anything. The walls of the office that had once felt like a safe, predictable environment now felt suffocating. The secrecy, the whispered conversations, the unspoken understanding between the partners. John was beginning to understand that they were all part of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't until the following afternoon, when John was preparing to leave for the day, that he saw Robert again. This time, Robert wasn't alone. As John stepped out into the hallway, he saw Robert standing by the elevators, talking to a man John had never seen before. The stranger was tall, with dark hair and a sharp, angular face that seemed to belong to someone used to getting what they wanted. He was impeccably dressed in a dark suit, his posture stiff and commanding, as if he were used to having others bend to his will. John stopped dead in his tracks, his pulse quickening. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see the way the two men interacted. Robert, normally so composed, was listening intently to whatever the stranger was saying. There was something about the way Robert's eyes shifted, something almost deferential in his posture. John felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who knew they were in over their head, someone who was taking orders from a higher power. John was tempted to move closer, to listen in on the conversation, but he knew it would be a mistake. He had already crossed a line when he had overheard their previous conversation in the conference room. If he pushed any further, there would be no going back. Still, his curiosity gnawed at him relentlessly. Who was this man? Why was Robert so submissive around him? And what did it all mean for John? As the two men continued their conversation, John's mind raced. He couldn't help but feel like he was standing on the edge of something monumental, something that would change everything he thought he knew about his life, his work, and even Robert. The more he tried to dismiss the thoughts, the more they consumed him. He needed answers. He needed to know the truth. The conversation finally ended, and Robert and the stranger exchanged a few words before walking in opposite directions. Robert headed back toward his desk, while the stranger disappeared down the hallway, his footsteps fading into the distance. John's heart was pounding in his chest. He had no idea what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever Robert was involved in, it was much bigger than he had anticipated. And now, John was in deeper than ever before. He couldn't walk away now. Not after everything he had seen. Not after everything he had heard. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered all around him, and he could feel the pressure building. Robert had become a man of mystery, someone who played by a different set of rules. But John wasn't sure he liked the game anymore. The web had tightened around him, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't escape. It was only a matter of time before the truth came to light, and John had no idea how much of it he could handle. That night, as John sat alone in his apartment, staring at the stack of legal documents on his coffee table, he realized that his life was no longer in his control. The choices he had made, the decisions he had refused to confront, those were now pushing him into a dangerous territory, one that threatened to consume him whole. He had wanted answers, and now he was beginning to see that the answers came with a price. There was no turning back now. The days after John's growing realization that something far darker was at play felt like a continuous haze of uncertainty. He had pushed himself to the limits, trying to maintain his facade of normalcy, arriving early, working late, trying to focus on the routine matters that used to fill his days. But now, every document he reviewed, every email he answered, felt disconnected from the life he was now living. The world around him seemed increasingly foreign, as though he were watching it through a fog, unable to touch or affect anything within it. His own office, once a place of comfort and productivity, now felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on him. The tension of the situation, of his own growing awareness of Robert's involvement in something far more sinister, had taken over his every waking thought. Each time John passed Robert in the office, he could feel the subtle shift in their dynamic. The distance between them had grown, more palpable now than ever before. Robert's quiet composure, his controlled movements, his ability to remain utterly unfazed by the unraveling chaos. John could no longer ignore the stark contrast between his own unease and Robert's seeming indifference. It was as though Robert had already accepted the reality of whatever he was a part of, while John was still stumbling in the dark, trying to find his bearings. Despite the growing sense of dread, John had made a choice. There was no turning back. Now. The more he tried to push the matter out of his mind, the deeper he found himself entangled in Robert's web. His once quiet office had become a battleground of his own making, and the stakes were higher than anything he had imagined when he first started working there. As much as he wanted to distance himself, as much as he wanted to ignore the signs, he knew that he couldn't. It was time for him to confront Robert again, to get the answers he had been desperately seeking. And so, when John saw Robert walking down the hallway late one Thursday evening, long after the office had emptied out, he felt a surge of urgency flood his chest. He wasn't sure what he planned to say, or even what he hoped to achieve by the conversation. But he knew it had to happen. There was a sense of inevitability in his every step as he walked toward Robert, his mind racing with the questions he had yet to voice. Robert was standing by the break room, leaning against the counter with his arms crossed. His usual air of collected professionalism had slipped away, replaced by an almost imperceptible weariness. For the first time, John saw a flicker of vulnerability in Robert's demeanor, a subtle crack in the armor that he had worn so expertly for years. It was a small thing, but to John, it was enough. It was a crack in the facade. Without hesitation, John approached. Robert's eyes flickered up to meet his, but he didn't move. The air between them was charged, heavy with the unsaid words that had built up over the past few weeks. "Robert," John began, his voice quieter than he intended. The uncertainty was still there, but this time it was different. This time John wasn't trying to avoid the confrontation. He was ready. "I need to understand what's going on. What's happening here? What have you gotten involved in?" For a moment, Robert didn't answer. He just stared at John, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he pushed himself off the counter and turned to face John fully, his posture shifting ever so slightly. There was no fear in Robert's eyes. No hint of hesitation, only something that John couldn't place. Resignation? Sorrow? But no fear. Robert had made his choice a long time ago. "You don't want to know," Robert said quietly, his voice betraying none of the tension that John felt tightening in his own chest. "Trust me. It's better for you to walk away, John. You don't belong in this world." John's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. He wasn't going to back down now. "I've already seen too much," John replied, his voice steadier now. "I've heard too much. You can't just keep pretending that I don't know something is happening. What have you dragged me into, Robert? What is this? What are you doing?" For a moment, Robert didn't speak. His gaze hardened, his jaw clenched as if fighting with himself, weighing whether he should tell John what he already knew, whether it would be worth the cost. John could feel the tension in the air, thickening by the second. Finally, Robert spoke. The words that followed were soft, but they landed like a heavy blow. "It's bigger than you think, John. There are things happening here that you wouldn't understand. People in power, people who make the rules, people who control things on a level you don't even see. This isn't just about legal work. It's about influence, it's about leverage, and it's about power." John felt his stomach twist, his pulse spiking. It wasn't just business. It wasn't just about some quiet deals made behind closed doors. It was politics. It was corruption. And he had already found himself in the middle of it, whether he wanted to be or not. "I've tried to stay out of it," Robert continued, his voice quieter now, more solemn. "But once you're in, there's no way out. I didn't choose this. It's just the way things work. This is how the world turns." John couldn't breathe. Everything he had suspected, everything that had been gnawing at him for weeks, had just been confirmed. Robert wasn't just another lawyer. He wasn't just a colleague. He was a cog in a much larger, much more dangerous machine, one that John hadn't even realized existed until it was too late. John took a step back, his mind racing, his thoughts in chaos. He had known that there was something wrong, but this was worse than he could have imagined. This wasn't just a small, personal betrayal. This was a systemic issue, a corruption that ran far deeper than he had ever thought possible. And now John was inextricably linked to it. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. There was no going back. He was already too far involved. "What do you want from me, Robert?" John's voice cracked, the weight of his words pressing down on him. "What do you want me to do?" Robert met his gaze, his eyes dark and resigned. "I don't want anything from you, John. I never did. But you're already in. You've already seen too much, heard too much. And now there's no way to walk away without consequences." The words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken truth. John felt the weight of them press down on him, crushing him under their enormity. There was no way out. He was already trapped, in this world, tied to it in a way that he couldn't escape. And even if he tried, even if he ran, he knew deep down that the consequences would follow him. John's mind raced with panic, with fear, with disbelief. What had he gotten himself into? What could he possibly do now? How could he fix this? How could he undo the damage? But the answers were elusive, slipping through his fingers like sand. There was no easy way out. There never had been. The web had already wrapped around him, pulling him deeper into its tangled threads. And just like that, it was over. The finality of Robert's words left John standing in the cold silence of the break room, staring at a future that had once seemed so simple, now twisted and beyond his comprehension. There was no going back. The choices he had made, the path he had walked down, everything had led him here. And now, all he could do was watch as his life crumbled around him. The firm, once a place of order and routine, had become his prison. And no matter how hard he tried to deny it, he knew it was only a matter of time before the consequences of his involvement would catch up with him. There was no escaping the truth anymore. It was too late.